Okay, so let's look at Africa. So super much, in a large part because a lot of this stuff that we're going to be looking at again comes from a much later period. And we don't know how far back some of this stuff goes. It can be kind of hard to tell because a lot of the evidence was wiped out by Europeans later on. We have been looking at Egypt, which people don't think of as part of Africa, but is part of Africa. And the northern part of Africa was definitely a big part of the Roman Empire, a big part of its food supply. All this stuff up here, like Tunisia and Morocco, these were associated with the Roman Empire. And then later on, they become associated with the Islamic caliphates. But around the Middle Ages as well, we also have developments in cultures here, pretty significant developments, empires even. We have kingdoms that are managed to take over the others and become pretty successful. And we're going to look at a few real quick here. And sort of try and get some understanding of them, even though we don't have as much evidence as we would like. We've got the Empire of Mali, we've got the Empire of Ethiopia, and we've got Zimbabwe down here. Very interesting. Is kind of like those early empires um, in what you would call it in say in Mesopotamia and whatnot. And this is happening around the 1200s, so Middle Ages, a time period in Europe. It's like the Sumerian empires because it unites all these different cities. These city states get together and make an alliance and start becoming one kingdom. But the interesting thing is that by this time, Islam has advanced far enough and is a common enough presence throughout North Africa that here in Western Africa, they're picking it up too. So Mali embraced Islam, became an Islamic culture, even though not directly politically connected to the caliphate, but built a lot of mosques and became connected to Islam primarily through trade routes. So these are people who cross through the desert on camels and sail, and have some connections through boats sailing across the sea, connecting to the other parts of the world. And Mali is able to get a lot of wealth because what have they got? They've got gold. They've got tons and tons of gold. And they trade with the other empires, with North Africa and whatnot, with the Caliphate. And they have some particular sort of gold deposits in part of their kingdom. And one of the most famous incidents in the kingdom of Mali interacting with the world shows off the wealth of this kingdom. This is a guy named Mansa Musa. So Mansa Musa, he's a Muslim and he wants to go to Mecca like all Muslims are supposed to do. So this king goes on this grand tour of Africa and taking the journey all the way to Mecca with a whole bunch of other people who wanted to go with him. And the king is showing off all his gold and wealth. So it's a chance for him to flex his power as well and show how wealthy this kingdom is. He's showing off gold, how much gold he's got. He's spending gold like crazy. And the Muslim world can't stop talking about it. For centuries, they're still talking about this rich king from Mali. And in fact, he spent so much that he kind of crashed the market for gold in the Muslim world for a while there. That for a few decades, that gold was not as valuable because Mansa Musa just dumped so much of it on people. And yeah, he's still remembered in medieval histories as being this great king holding, the gold that he had, and this African king. So that's a pretty interesting figure in history. Moving on to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is kind of wild because while most of Africa is known for an Islamic influence, Ethiopia is very Christian. So Ethiopia picked up Christianity early on in the 300s and stayed Christian. Had a lot of traditions around being Christian, and just continued on in that direction. They also had a kind of a slightly weird form of Christianity. That's it's kind of hard to explain the details, but basically they thought the nature of Jesus was different. They thought Jesus was sort of one unified God thing instead of having a human characteristic and a divine characteristic. They thought he was something sort of beyond human in certain ways. And these are the kind of debates that Christians would have. So on the one hand, you've got Ethiopia being Christian in sort of a Muslim part of the world. On the other hand, you've got some differences from the standard traditional Christianity. They put up a lot of these monumental stones, which are called stelae. Ever since Greek times, they were called stelae, but Ethiopia is kind of known for these stone monuments. And Traditionally, the Church of Ethiopia says that they have the Ark of the Covenant. So they have the tablets that Moses made as a contract with God. At least that's what they say. It's hard to know because they don't let outsiders see them, but that's how the tradition goes. Ethiopia is also known as Aksum and Abyssinia, and as you can imagine, the idea that there was this Christian place in Africa was the source of quite a lot of fascination for the Christians in Europe. And so these names, they all take on a kind of a mystical quality. And there are also legends that appear in the Christian Middle Ages of this sort of magical Christian king. So they had this story that there was a Christian kingdom where they had the Fountain of Youth, where they had immortality. They might even have the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel, and this perfect king who was this noble, Christian leader, ruled over all of them. Maybe he even had monsters, but he had converted them to Christianity. And this story was really popular during the Crusades because they felt like, oh, this king, he's going to come from somewhere in the east, maybe in the vicinity of India, and he's going to come along and save us. He's going to defeat the Muslims for us. That was the feeling that people had during the Crusades. And probably the way this legend originated is that there was this real Christian kingdom, although they slightly got the location wrong, over in Ethiopia in Africa, and that probably inspired the idea of this distant Christian source of help. Although the Ethiopians never really, as far as I know, were able to contribute too much to the Crusades. But yeah, the legend of Prester John, it captivated people, and people couldn't stop talking about the idea of this king, this holy sort of Christian emperor over in the east somewhere. Okay, and the last kingdom I want to mention is Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is all the way down in South Africa, but we see some pretty spectacular ruins. These huge cities with these very elaborate stone walls, these sort of ivory and ebony artifacts. It seems like there was a pretty strong kingdom there. And this is one of those kingdoms that was kind of systematically wiped out by Europeans. So we don't know as much about it as we'd like. But it shows that there were, Europeans have a tendency to think of Africa as not having very much going on. There was a lot going on. There were, kingdoms, there were empires, but Europeans kind of wiped a lot of that out. But it's important to remember, and there's a lot more to dig into this stuff. We just didn't have time to go into it all here, which says something about what do we consider priorities and all that. But there just know that the culture of Great Zimbabwe is its own culture that is very well worth looking into as well. Okay. So that's Africa. Let's finish up with some developments in the Americas. We haven't looked at them in quite a while.